get some people who could hold hearings, listen to every aspect of this, view what the legislature did, take it into consideration, the relationship with other public servants got, whether it was a school superintendent, school principal, whether it was a judge, and do the right thing in terms of what a legislator actually was entitled to, without regard to politics. Who was in control of the legislature? Who was the governor? Who would gain an advantage by being opposed to pay raises, blah, blah. So we came up with this. Roy Spencer, a
Republican legislature, poultry farmer from the thumb again, like Allison Green.
Yeah, he was from Lapeer.
Right.
And he always looked after agriculture. We got along famously well. He was also an expert on taxation.
Mm-hmm.
And he later was appointed to the State Tax Commission.
Right.
And I've lost track of him since then. But in any event, on discussions with Roy, and Roy always had supported a pay raise for the legislature. He was for it. And I said, well, would you be willing to consider sponsoring this resolution? He said, absolutely. So we went over it carefully. He had some ideas. We incorporated that into it, and that became a constitutional proposal and put on the ballot. The newspapers were on strike, and it came up in the primary election.
Right, in August of 1968.
It passed.
And it passed. But even the newspapers that weren't on strike out state, they supported it. They basically said they thought this sounds like a very reasonable idea.
Yeah.
The idea that the newspapers would have all opposed it, you know, if they hadn't all, or the major ones in Detroit, been on strike, I don't think that's true. I think you think that they might have smelled a rat or something and thought this is a way to circumvent.
Surreptitiously.
Well, I don't know, whatever. But anyway, it passed, so that's how it got on. How do you think it's worked over time?
Poorly.
Why has it worked poorly?
Because the legislature wouldn't let the process work. And they were the first ones to badmouth it. And, I mean, for political gain, if anybody who opposed a pay raise was a hero.
Right.
And
so
even
the
though
legislature would say, well, our hands are tied. We can't do anything about it. It shouldn't exist this way, but we can't do anything. Our salaries are being hiked, and we can't stop the salaries from being hiked, and don't hold us responsible.
Correct.
Somebody back decades ago did this.
Yes. I take credit for that.
Well, they did do one adjustment to it. Now they have to have an affirmative vote on whatever the recommendations are. That's the only thing that's been done, and that was just done in the last decade or so as a public reaction. Let me ask you one other thing. Mm-hmm. Part-time versus full-time legislature. You mentioned that one of the things that you pushed for in 65, 66 was to modernize the legislative branch of government compared to the executive and to beef up staff. One of the things that the majority Democrats did was say, look, we think really we deserve to be in session maybe a full year if we have to be. Before that, I mean, you could have been in session a full year, but no legislature in the previous 130 had ever done that. They all disbanded in the spring. They only got paid $5,000, and they'd go back to plant seed or have their regular jobs. You guys started to professionalize the legislature, and you also didn't want the governor to be able to call you into special session at his beck and call on whatever issue he wanted to call you into session on. And so you basically started to go full-time, and we have had a full-time legislature ever since in some way, shape, or form. Now, of course, there are two ballot proposal initiative petition drives to try and convert us back by constitutional fiat or by statute to a part-time legislature. Making the legislature stop being full-time. How do you look at this whole issue?
I think that the legislature of 65, 66 didn't consciously say we're going to be here full-time most of the year. What happened was we had an immense agenda. I can recall walking out of the Capitol on the 4th of July morning, watching the sun come up, thinking, gee, I've got to get back home. We're having a family picnic starting at 11 o'clock, and I can't miss that. My children, and so it wasn't so much that we sat as both sides of the aisle and said we're going to work this thing into a full-time job. It was a full-time job given the backup that was perceived in the legislature to enacting what was considered to be legislation that had been stalled, never considered for several decades.
And also, you had to reorganize all of state government as a result of the enactment of the new Constitution.
Yeah.
So you had an enormous responsibility thrust on you that you hadn't even asked for.
No, and frankly, when I was elected, I wasn't aware of. Had no idea of the dimensions of a new Constitution in terms of authorizing legislation.
Right.
20 agencies of government, whittled down a mammoth structure into 20 compartments.
Right.
An illustration.
Absolutely.
And Edie O'Brien did a superb job in that regard. Really.
Okay. Let's talk about another controversial issue of the early 1970s, no-fault divorce. You were chairman of the House Judiciary Committee when that legislation went through. What happened? How controversial was it?
Well, it was a recommendation of the I'm trying to recall, Jason Honeyman was the chairman of it for many, many years. It was established by statute, I believe, and Law Revision Commission.
Law Revision Commission,
And
right.
Jason Honeyman was the chairman.
Right.
They sent all kinds of legislation coming out of uniform state law commissioners. Some of it was necessary business legislation. Some of it dealt with simply judicial questions. The issue of no-fault divorce came to the legislature from them. And Jason had discussed it when he said, what if we were to recommend to the legislature a statute creating a no-fault divorce? And I thought that divorce was a fact of life in America, that you can't stick your head in the sand and say we'll make it go away, and that the fault divorce were the accusations created enmity that carried over into custody of children, care for children, split families permanently in terms of the children following divorce, created situations that were just unbeatable and unbearable, and even the best of judges could not reconcile the couples sometimes following a divorce in relationship to their relationship with children because of the animosity that existed between the two parties. So there were all kinds of arguments for it. My more conservative friends would say, oh, you made divorce easy. The psychologists and sociologists would say, it's not made easy. No divorce is easy. And you recognize the fact of life that sometimes in people's lives, it's time to part, rather than live together in a marital relationship that's non-existent. And the fault system worked to the benefit of attorneys, sometimes to the parties themselves, too often, in fact. So we caused that to be introduced. We brought it out on the floor. It met with, I think, approval. We didn't have an immense backlash.
And there wasn't a strong partisan division
No.
in the House and Senate on it when it finally passed. Got
Yes.
a lot of Republican votes as well.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay, let's move to one of the most exciting aspects of your tenure as chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and that is the nickname and the accomplishments that go with being Bingo Bob. Bingo Bob. Tell us all about that and the lottery and everything that happened. This is the early 1970s.
But before I came to the legislature, there was always an effort on behalf of many members of the House, especially Democrats, that bingo would be authorized, legalized. And it couldn't be done by statute because the Constitution prohibited, my memory is games of chance is the term used. And I ran on a pro-bingo platform and felt very strongly committed to fulfilling that plank. And there was a lot of sentiment in the House towards getting